Alrighty, good morning everyone. We'll get the session started now. We've still got people slowly joining, so I'll go through the initial few screens quite slowly. Just for the moment, as I mentioned, please let me know if you're having any issues hearing me using the question box, yeah, we'll commence. So, introductions and formalities. For those of you who haven't attended these sessions previously, we like to hold these as a fairly informal conversation piece. Really, the objective of these sessions is probably to help people take away some questions and some insights around the topic. In this case, obviously, we're talking about mLearning, and again, the focus of this is to, I guess, provide some perspective about the interpretation of mLearning, really some considerations around going into an mLearning project, and really give you guys a bit of an opportunity to take some things away. Next time you're looking at mLearning, having a few questions and a few thoughts that you can run through and sort of get a better understanding of if a project shouldn't be mLearning, what it will look like, what are the benefits, trade-offs, etc. In terms of introductions and formalities, I'm Raf Dolanowski. I'm the head of client solutions here at Pure Learning. I've been in the e-learning industry for about 8 years, just a little over now, and that has given me the opportunity to, I guess, see a lot of evolution in the space, and also an opportunity to be able to see all ends of the spectrum, from stuff that's been really terrible all the way through to stuff that's been quite cutting edge. mLearning in particular is a topic I'm very passionate about. It's something that I feel has a lot of merit, but as with all things, it has to be used correctly, just to make sure that you actually get outcomes from it, versus, I guess, a bit of a technology fixation. So, I guess the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is, what is mLearning? I think this is an important question to ask because the term has a lot of varying definitions depending who you speak to, and some of them perhaps are oversimplistic. So I guess this is probably the most common interpretation of what mLearning is, and it is rather simplistic. You know, it's e-learning on a mobile device, right? I guess yes and no. I think for me, what having this sort of view of mLearning does is it focuses very heavily on technology as the defining factor of mLearning, rather than, I guess, the actual consideration and planning that needs to go into creating something that is going to be truly mLearning and really effective. So if we I guess have a bit of a think about, okay, what are the things we need to understand about mLearning? So mLearning is obviously learning, I'd say, more on the move than more on a mobile device. So its unique features, when you compare it, I guess, against e-learning and other learning formats, is all of a sudden you have all of these questions you have to ask yourself. When is a learner going to be doing this? Where are they going to be doing this? A critical question is obviously on what, but ultimately a very important one is, why are they doing it in that particular environment, on that particular device, and at that particular time? And I think these are questions that you really need to think about when you're looking at jumping onto an mLearning project, because these lay down the groundwork of, I guess, having a clear idea of if what you're thinking about is going to work. I think very often what happens is you go down a path where mLearning is an add-on to an e-learning solution. So there's a solution designed, and we know that people will be doing it in office time, so covers the when, where they'll be doing it at their desk because they're going to have designated time. They're going to be doing it on their desktop, and the reason is because their managers are going to give them time to do it. And then there's a requirement for, hey, let's also make it mobile. It's like, well, why? If the environment and the plan is for a piece of learning to be at a designated time in the office on a desktop, mLearning doesn't gain a benefit. But what it does potentially do is add some restrictions because there are particular considerations when it comes to designing something that's effectively going to work as mLearning that restrict your ability to deliver something that will be, I guess, as in tune with the capability of a desktop environment. So as I sort of mentioned, the big drivers for me when it comes to mLearning is when and where. And this is something I'm going to keep coming back to during this presentation. But understanding when is someone going to be doing this will dictate ultimately a lot of the direction for a particular solution. If something is an on-demand piece, the when becomes less, I guess, a specific figure, 9 a.m. lunchtime after work. It becomes more of a more subjective answer in terms of it'll be on demand. They'll do it when they need it. And obviously to that point also, the where comes into it. So when you go down the path of creating on-demand learning, which I believe is probably the key alignment when you're talking about mLearning, on-demand and mLearning for me go hand in hand, all of a sudden you really don't know where someone will be doing it. So at that point, it probably becomes a process of elimination. Okay, what can we say about our audience most likely doing this? So if it is on-demand training and it is designed for mobile, then we can fairly confidently say they won't be doing it at their desk. I mean, who'd want to complete a piece of training on their mobile phone when they're sitting at a desk with access to a perfectly good desktop? So you start to unpack that and go, okay, what can we know? And I guess if you look at a situation of maybe a good example is site inductions, perhaps. So contractors and that. A lot of organisations have contractors. And okay, so they're going to be out in the field. They're going to be going to a particular site. And then you start to unpack the when and where. So when, on demand, when they arrive at a site. And where will they be doing it? At their specific site. Okay, so from that we know one, we want to keep it short. We know that they're going to be arriving on this site and their motivation is going to be to get onto that site and do their role as quickly as possible. This piece of mLearning would be, I guess, the barrier they need to get through in order to start their job. So all of a sudden when you start to look at the when and where, you start to think about, okay, how are we going to design this training? If it is a case of, a contractor induction going onto site, you probably wouldn't design lots of scenario-based activities, lots of interaction, lots of stories in it, because ultimately what they need is the information that allows them to safely access that site, to complete this training on that location and move on with, I guess, their day. So from there, I guess, as I mentioned, mLearning is really mobile learning. And again, the mobile aspect of it is not so much as in mobile phone, but learning on the move. And I think that is something, again, we have to keep circling back to this and understand that the defining feature of mLearning is not that is done on a device such as a phone or such as a tablet. I believe that mLearning can absolutely be on a laptop. Technology is regardless. Someone could arrive at a location where they need on-demand training and they are on the move, they're not at their desk, and they need a piece of mLearning that will be available to them on their laptop because they move from site to site to site and they are mobile and they need a learning solution that will be able to move with them. So I know I'll keep circling back to this and potentially sound like a broken record, but the big thing that I always say to clients and whoever I'm speaking to about mLearning is don't look at it as a solution that is defined by being done on a mobile or an iPad. Don't look at the technology, look at the need, look at your audience, and truly identify if that audience and their circumstances requires them to be mobile. And from there, you can derive what sort of devices they will be accessing it on, which obviously plays a part in designing this sort of solution. So in terms of, I guess, that mobile space, and this is a cool little cartoon to depict it. So for me, as I mentioned at the start, there's a difference between doing e-learning on a mobile device versus mLearning. So here we've got a character, and I guess the idea here is to depict he's completing some sort of training piece on his mobile phone, but he's at his desk, he's got his coffee, he's in what I like to call, I guess, a committal environment. He sat down at his desk, made a conscious decision that the next 20, 30 minutes of his time is going to be committed to completing a piece of e-learning. And he just happens to be doing it on a mobile device because of his choice. On the flip side, we've got this guy. So this guy is actually doing mLearning, so he's on a train. He is actually on a move. And the thing that changes as soon as you move from one environment to the other is the factors that impact you from that environment. So obviously, if you're at your desk and all that, you're able to control the environment you're in quite well. You designate a certain amount of time to complete the task, which means you're in control of, okay, I'll put my emails window to the back. I won't be doing something else. I'm in an environment where others probably won't distract me, and it's quite controlled. As soon as you go to, I guess, an mLearning environment, so an environment that puts the learner in a mobile state as they're learning, all of a sudden you've got all these new factors. Are they comfortable? What sort of distractions do they have? How much time do they have available? For example, if our little character here was, only going 2 stops on a tram, his attention span, his ability to consume content, and I guess how much mental capacity he has to complete that training is a lot less than if we had, say, a character who was doing their morning commute and had an hour on the train. You still have various impacts in terms of distractions, but you start to see that the environment starts to be quite critical. And with mLearning, because as I mentioned, I think on demand is the thing that's best aligned with. What that means is if a learner is on a tram and goes, I've got 5 minutes to complete some training, they need to know that the on-demand training they have is going to be able to take them about 5 minutes or so. It also has to be something that they can pick up and put down because, again, distractions, their plan is, okay, I've got 5 minutes. What happens if 2 minutes into that there's an emergency on the tram? What happens if at that point someone gets on the tram and distracts them? What happens if their environment changes? There's all these things that are outside of their control, and at that point their plan that potentially gives them 5 minutes is thrown out the window. And what we need to be mindful of is as soon as you introduce these distractions, you can't rely on, I guess, what we do very often in e-learning is people being able to remember what they did, maybe in the last section or whatnot, because they're going to be so distracted that the last section may have been 3 trams, ago, a day before. So all of a sudden you start to go, okay, mLearning looks a little bit different. There's probably less reliance on remembering things from 5 minutes ago. It has to be more self-contained. It has to be designed, I guess, to embrace distraction and embrace the fact that it is going to be, I guess, not so much disposable, but something that the learner will very quickly pick up and put down. They won't be motivated to try and complete a piece in one go. That piece has to be aligned to what they're doing, and it's just a filler activity between, I guess, their goals in their day-to-day. So this leads to, okay, so why is someone on the move? Why have you identified that your learner is going to be on the move and therefore they need an mLearning solution? So I guess some of the common things that we can look at is, are they time poor? So something that you often, I guess, hear of in organizations is that your audience is very time poor and they don't really have time to complete a piece of training during office hours. So outside of office hours is when they're consuming it. And again, is the expectation that at that point they'll get home and consume it? Or do we find that the learners are going to generally prefer to do it on the train home, or what does that look like? Another factor for, I guess, learners doing things on the move is they do it when they need it. So again, back to on demand. As I mentioned with, for example, the contractor induction piece, they might be doing it when they need it because they've arrived at a particular location. They might be doing this training when they arrive at a particular task in their role and they go, I need to quickly access some additional information. They might be doing it because they're just about to go to, say, an area that has safety requirements and they need to learn about it. So there's I guess, that component of I need to complete something, and this is why I'm doing this training at the moment. I guess a really nice example of this on-demand learning that people do in their day-to-day already is if someone gets a new device or needs to do something, the first thing people do is they jump on Google or YouTube and they look up a how-to video. I know whenever I get a new piece of technology or whatnot, I certainly don't go through the manual. I jump on YouTube, a forum, and I get that learning when I need it at that point in time in the dose I need it. So not everything, the specific bit I need. And I guess with mLearning, we have to be mindful that we need to design something that is quite reflective of the control that people have of how they consume content in their day-to-day. Obviously, another reason that someone might be doing learning on the move is if their role keeps them going. So I guess sales reps is someone who would potentially be doing learning on the move because they don't have a fixed location. Ultimately, that kind of cascades into the next item. They're doing it on the move because they don't have access to another device and they're time poor, so they're going to do it in between getting to clients, whatever that looks like. It might be that they're at a cafe and they complete it. So these are all, I guess, factors to consider is, okay, why is our audience on the move? Why do they need training that will work for them as they're moving around? And how does that differ from, I guess, desktop training? Excuse me. And kind of circling to the device side of things, and this is I guess a really big piece for me. So when we talk mLearning, something you very often see, and I guess it's a fairly logical assumption, is that mobile devices go together. So your mobile phone and your tablets, they kind of are clustered together, and then your laptops and your desktops are clustered together. Now this family tree, what I've done here is, as you can see, up the sort of top left, I've got a mobile phone on its own little branch, and then on the main branch, I've got laptops, tablets, and desktop devices. Now, for me, the reason for this is that from a lot of perspectives, the way you design a solution for a tablet is significantly more related to how you design a solution for a laptop and a desktop than it is for a mobile. And I think this is both from an environmental perspective, from an ergonomic perspective, and from looking at when people use tablets. And I've got some interesting stats and some links to some research on the next few slides. But the big one is that whilst I guess from a technology perspective, you look at mobile phones and tablets, and you again can go, their defining features, they're both mobile. When we're talking mLearning solutions, you really have to think about the other considerations. Okay, is picking up a phone and doing some learning on it the same as picking up a tablet and doing some learning on it. And I think there's a big difference, because picking up a tablet, generally speaking, someone's committing their time to a piece of learning, versus a mobile phone. It really is a case of, I just need something quickly now because I am on the move. If they weren't on the move, then most likely they'd be trying to complete it on a desktop or on a tablet device. From a purely ergonomic standpoint, that's what people, I guess, are more likely to do. It's not a pleasant experience to try and complete a piece of learning on a mobile phone, purely through design, screen, the fact you're going to be distracted, and the ergonomics of it. So I guess this for me leads to the question, which is really important, which is, what device is the mLearning solution being designed for? And this is a question that really goes against the grain, where you look at a lot of technology out there, and the big flagship piece for a lot of technology around e-learning at the moment is responsiveness. Create this one piece of learning and it'll change the way it looks to suit all devices, which is fine, and that sounds great. But then when you think about it, you kind of end up with something that will work on all devices but isn't designed for any. So for example, if I was designing a solution for desktop, I would know that someone's going to be in an environment without distraction. They're going to have a mouse as their input device. They're going to be quite familiar with using that mouse. I know the types of interactions they're familiar with. And it also gives me a lot of freedom to create more complex interactions, a lot more interactivity in the piece, because all that stuff is really easy. If, on the other hand, that solution was to be deployed on a mobile, all of a sudden all those interactions, which are perhaps innovative and really engaging on a desktop, become a real hassle to complete. So I'm thinking, for example, you've got a course where you have a situation that's maybe a soft skill. So you're having a conversation and you've got some material around the situation. The learner has situation-based options to complete, and on a screen you can lay that out nicely. You've got one character on one side, a little bit of context, the options, it's well balanced, it's probably got a nice split, and you're not too restricted with how much information you get on there. Transfer that to the mobile device, and realistically that you're going to introduce scrolling, because the amount of content has to change, and the interactions all of a sudden become, they go from being a mouse movement that's maybe a centimeter or two, they all of a sudden become straining your thumb from maybe middle of the screen all the way to the bottom of the screen. And again, in the links I've sort of got, they talk about that when designing solutions for touch-based devices. I think there's a 10% margin or so. There's a rule where they say if you put things that people are interacting with around the edges, from a UX perspective, they're not going to enjoy that interaction. The interaction is actually more difficult. So people generally start from the middle of their interactions and work outwards. So all your interactions should be in the center of the screen. And what that means is all of a sudden you don't have a whole screen to play with as you do with perhaps a desktop device, where accessing any point of the screen is relatively easy, to all your critical stuff really having to be in the middle. And then by the time you've squeezed everything in and you've got that button that is, bottom right, it's going to be something that learners are not enjoying from an ergonomic perspective and a UX perspective. I've put this question in twice, again, because normally when you ask clients or talk to any organizations around, okay, what devices is going to be designed for, you get the answer, all devices, and straight after that it's okay, yeah, but what devices is designed for? Understanding how the audience is expected to access it impacts the design quite fundamentally. So knowing it's a case of, okay, we expect that people will complete this on desktop, and then maybe a tiny percentage would do on mobile, means you design a solution that's for desktop, and either say, hey, this is only for desktop, because as soon as we start adapting it to work on a mobile device, it'll start to have a negative impact on the design of the solution for the majority of the audience, versus maybe in other cases, it's a case of, okay, we know people will be completing this on their mobile phone for reasons X, Y, and Z, then great. design a solution that works for mobile phones. As I said, for me, if you're doing something for desktop, you can probably stretch as far as tablets, but I wouldn't say that a solution that works on desktop is going to work on mobile. The device, the interaction, the environment is just too separate. So in terms of, I guess, just a few screens to go through the design of things. For me, obviously, this is a layout of a desktop screen. You've obviously got a nice split, and generally speaking, we find that the interaction happens sort of bottom right in terms of if you've got next and back buttons or anywhere on the screen. So nothing revolutionary here. What we have here is, I guess, this is by a whisker the most popular way of holding a tablet device for people. So what they found, and you can have a look at that link that I've got at the bottom, but generally speaking, people hold their tablets in landscape, and I believe the stat is 59% versus 41% who hold it in portrait. Also, what they do with the device impacts how they hold it. So for example, if someone's reading, I guess, a paper or a book or a digital book, they're more likely to hold it in portrait mode, whilst if they're doing something that's interactive, there's a higher chance that they'll be holding it in landscape mode. I guess for us, the thing to take away from that is, depending how the solution's been designed, you want to take into consideration how it's going to be held. And in most cases, given that we strive for having, I guess, engaging and relatively interactive solutions, you want to design for the landscape orientation, because that's going to be how you expect your learners to generally interact with it. Other considerations, obviously, as soon as you start going down that path, is, okay, if they're holding this device, how are they going to interact with it? So the percentages, again, are, generally speaking, people will hold the device in their left hand and use their right hand as the button, as the hand for interaction, or they'll use the kind of two-thumb approach, which seems to be more towards people who are comfortable with gaming devices and all that. So all these things, all of a sudden, you're starting to consider how someone going to reach that button. If they're holding it side and side, and back and next buttons probably stop being bottom right together. They might be at either end of the screen. And then it's a case of, okay, do we feel that that's going to be the appropriate interaction type, or do we feel that swipe is going to be something people are more comfortable doing? And then we arrive at the mobile phone. So with the mobile phone, the stats are that 60% of the time, people will hold the device in one hand, which is their dominant hand, for tasks that don't require data input. So for example, interacting, reading something and all that, it's going to be in one hand holding it roughly how we've got depicted here. As soon as you move into a task that's data entry, so completing an online form or something like that, people will generally switch to holding it in two hands, using their thumbs to interact with it, and all of a sudden the interaction changes, but there is quite a distinct difference between the task to how people hold it. And finally, the least common way of holding a mobile phone is in landscape, which seems to be specifically when you're doing a task, or you've got an app that requires you to hold it like that. So generally speaking, people prefer portrait mode when talking mobile devices. They prefer to hold it in one hand and interact with it with their thumb. The next level up from that is two hands for data entry type stuff. And again, these are things to consider. Something else I guess we can think about is in this perspective of, okay, so I am standing on a train, it's peak hour, I'm on the Melbourne train system, so it is packed like sardines. I'm holding onto the hand holder up above my head, fairly safe that due to my environment, all of a sudden I am restricted to just one hand interaction using my thumb. At which point I guess we start thinking about, okay, the rule of thumb interaction. Can a learner interact with this solution using simply their thumb, and is it going to be comfortable? If we look at, I guess, the hand positioning, and try this yourself, if we designed a solution where organically the interface positions the buttons, back and next buttons or whatever, at the bottom of the screen, if you have to interact with that every single time, you are going to have some issues with a very cramped thumb. And I guess that goes back to the stuff around, not having things around the edges. So all of a sudden, probably for a mobile solution, the organic thing to do is have scrolling as a way of navigating, and then any expected interactions, probably keeping them in the middle section of the screen to ensure that people don't get fatigue of the thumb. Obviously, the other consideration there being is if you have a really long course, no matter what you do, they're probably going to get a fatigued thumb. And again, it's interesting when you talk about this stuff, it's an ergonomic consideration, but so often it's overlooked. It's just, it's such a focus on just the device. The device is held like this. People don't really think about how is that learner going to interact with it? Is it going to be comfortable? And I guess the reason all these things have to be considered is we know that people learn better if they're comfortable, if they're in a good mood, versus if they're uncomfortable and in a bad mood. So how you're holding the thumb and how you're making them interact with that device, if it isn't comfortable, if it isn't pleasant, it's actually going to lead to a lesser learning experience purely because it's not comfortable and it's just frustrating to interact with a solution. So I guess that's one thing that I always talk about is how are they going to interact with it, like really actually as a human being, how are they going to interact with this? And this is why I guess I have a bit of a pet disagreement with a lot of the technology that's out there. So here, this I've taken from the Adobe website. This is a quick, I guess, example of how their Captivate technology is responsive to all devices. So, okay, yep, on the laptop, yep, that seems fine, cool, nice and easy to interact with. On the tablet, yep, perhaps still all right. The buttons are probably starting to get into that space, which is towards the edge, and generally speaking with devices that are touch, again, as I mentioned, stuff needs to be more to the center of the device. But imagine trying to interact with that one on the mobile. Your thumb has to somehow reach the bottom right corner of the device, which is almost directly underneath where it is. What that leads to is either one, a change of position. So going back to, I guess, my train scenario or whatever it happens to be, all of a sudden I have to change hands or let go and interact with the training. So I've disrupted what I was doing to make myself as a human being be compatible with the technology rather than the technology being compatible with me as a human being. And I guess this is, a nice example of where, from a technology perspective, great, it adapts, fantastic. From a human perspective, it doesn't work. You need to design something that's very in tune with your needs. And as I said, I mean, for the mobile device, the solution will look quite different. The chunking of content will be quite different, and it kind of needs a lot more thought around the engagement piece. Other than that, obviously, this is a terrible example because on the desktop, I'd be able to see what's on that girl's screen. On that mobile phone, I may need a microscope or other assistive technology, which I probably won't have with me on the train, in the cab, or in the park. So we've just covered a lot of information. At this point, people were probably like, okay, great, cool, now we understand the point, mLearning, we get it, we consider it a device, we know how to work on device, awesome, we're ready to go. Maybe not quite. So I think purely looking from a technology perspective, there's a few more considerations. Obviously, as I mentioned, the interactive functionality. So now we've kind of considered all the human aspects of things and we go, okay, how is the interaction going to cater to that? What interactions do I have available to me? And this is something that obviously both sides of the equation, instructional designers, graphic designers, and multimedia developers need to be aware of, because all of a sudden, if they're designing something for a mobile, they're probably working with a restricted pool of devices. Another consideration is bandwidth. This is one that generally people consider, but again, what bandwidth does is if I know someone's completing a solution on a mobile device, I know that I have to be mindful of the bandwidth. What that means is I'll probably want to compress images more heavily, potentially not use as much video, not use as much sound, and not use as many assets. If I was designing a solution for desktop, I generally know that there's going to be good bandwidth, so all of a sudden I'd introduce more of those assets. What that means is if you try and create a solution that works on desktop and a mobile device, some part of that audience is going to suffer. If you've got a design that's very focused on desktop and someone accesses it on mobile, it's probably going to be slow. There's going to be potential dropouts. Things will load slowly. It won't be a good experience. On the flip side, if you design something that's very bandwidth conscious, you probably won't deliver the full engagement and the full potential of sitting at a desktop to people who are at desktops, because all of a sudden instances where you otherwise would have used video because it would have really delivered the message well, you have to think of some other way of delivering that material. And the last one is, I guess, real environmental considerations, and I know I keep circling back to this, but even to the point of night and day. So, and this might sound like a funny one, but for those of you who use your GPS or your phone for GPS, what you'll find is that depending on your model, when you go through a tunnel or when you go through a dark environment, that app adjusts. It changes the colors and all that because it knows, hey, we're in a darker environment. The person who's looking at the device is going to be looking into a dark environment. To have this blinding light of color and lines and directions is not going to be a good thing. And that applies completely to when we're thinking about learners. If we know that a piece of training is being designed, for example, for people who want to, who work on night shift, and the training is about how to keep yourself awake and aware on night shift, all of a sudden you kind of want to start considering what colors you're using. You don't want to blind these people if they're out in the field. You know, a lot of security companies, they'll have people going to different sites. They probably need a complete training. So even to that point, and not very many organizations and solutions think about it to that point, but if you're able to pinpoint your audience to that level, we know that they're going to be doing this outside in the sun. Great, probably lots of white and high contrasts, because we know on the device there'll be glare. If they're doing it at night, great, probably bring down saturations, use darker tones and all that so their eyes are able to adjust. So all of a sudden there's all these other things to consider when you're doing a mobile solution, which I guess often overlooked, not really considered, but will add again to the experience of the learner. So ultimately, I guess we've covered off a lot of the design, the technology, the considerations, but what about the content itself? And I'm going to, I guess, touch on this in not a staggering amount of detail, because this is a massive topic around, okay, what would the content look like? But the key considerations around, obviously, when you design the content is, again, why are they doing the learning on the move? And that will, I guess, be on demand or due to their job or whatever that looks like. That's going to impact what the end solution looks like. Obviously, if it's because it's on-demand training, you want to keep everything quite short. Again, if they're doing it on the move because they don't have access to another device, but they're most likely going to be able to commit, you can create learning that's a bit bigger than, I guess, your standard microbytes, because you know they'll be able to commit a time, but the reason they're doing it is a lack of access to another device. Again, where are they most likely to be doing it? To the example I mentioned at the start, so for contractors arriving at a location and needing to do some sort of safety or compliance training to access that location. At that point, their motivation is going to be to get through all the material as quickly as possible versus have scenarios and activities and a lot of the story stuff and that humanistic things. So that'll obviously impact the approach you have as an instructional designer, because if you start introducing stories and all that, they're most likely going to get frustrated. They're probably at site number 2 for the week or whatever it looks like, and they want to complete this training quickly so they can deliver their service. So their motivation is, I need the messaging to work at this site correctly. I need the information so that if I'm asked the questions or I'm audited, I have the information to show that I can work safely on this site. But beyond that, I don't need, a lot of complex interactions. I already know a lot of this stuff. Another consideration, this circles back to what I mentioned, is how distracted is your learner going to be? Obviously, as I mentioned, if there's going to be a lot of distractions, you can't rely on, I guess, their memory and their ability to retain and recall information as readily if they're than if they were in an environment that was, I guess, more controlled. And the last, I guess, consideration when writing a content from an instructional perspective is what interactions are available to me. As I mentioned, on a desktop, you've got probably a vast array of interactions, media types, and everything available to you. Whilst on a mobile device, depending which one you're aiming for, you're more restricted. Obviously, activities that work on a desktop, probably on a tablet, you can still get away with. Transfer them to a mobile, and you're starting to get into, I guess, a bit of a scary space, because those interactions go from being engaging and clever to frustrating and uncomfortable to complete. And all of this obviously impacts the instructional design of the course, because all of a sudden you've got different ways of motivating the learner that you need to consider, and you need to use different tools to engage them rather than relying heavily on interactions and all that sort of thing. So to, I guess, summarize what I've kind of covered off there, and I know there's probably a lot of things that it's a lot of material, and I've kind of looked at the tip of the iceberg in a lot of cases, but I'm hoping this gives you a lot of questions to walk away and a bit of insight into all the aspects that you need to consider. But I guess the top 5 tips when it comes to creating learning on the move, for me anyway, ask why mLearning. So why is a decision being made that this particular solution should be designed as an mLearning solution? Why is it a mobile solution? Is it a mobile solution because someone decided it would be a really good idea to make it mobile? Or is there actually a practical need for it to be mLearning? And I think sometimes it's very challenging to talk to a client to say, hey, this solution, you're rolling it out mostly to desktop. We're just going to make it for desktop. And I guess thereafter the flexibility of having it across all devices, but it's about talking them through and go, okay, well, if we're designing it for all devices, here's the things we need to be mindful of. The interactions maybe aren't going to be as great, which means you should have enough, I guess, points to talk them through from an environment perspective, a structure perspective, interaction perspective, to see why it makes more sense to be more targeted in terms of, is this a piece of, I guess, more traditional e-learning, or is this piece of actual mLearning? You can very much have on-demand e-learning in the form of little learning bites that still have complex interactions. It's a completely different solution to if you had that same on-demand training, but it was designed for mobile. So really asking them and getting them to talk through their motivations, and then it's obviously up to the team looking after the design to be able to validate those and talk a client through, okay, yep, makes sense as an mLearning solution, not really. And sometimes, as I said, the big one to try and overcome is just that blanket statement of, mLearning is the thing that everyone's talking about, it's really good, so we want it as mLearning. The right tool for the right job, making sure we're using that mLearning approach in the right instances is key. I think once you've identified, okay, this will be mLearning, keeping it, I guess, as short as possible for me. I think this is something we generally should strive with all e-learning, mLearning, and learning. But as soon as you go down that mLearning path, and particularly if you're talking mobile devices, you know that they're going to be distracted and it's probably going to be completed in between tasks. Keep it as short as possible and make sure it's something that people can complete in isolation. So there isn't a dependency of them remembering details of a previous solution or the previous chapter. It is little self-contained learning packages that are nice and short, they can digest easily, and they can come back to easily. We want people to be motivated to come back to this stuff as a refresher, going, that was nice and easy to do, I'll just jump in there. I know it'll only take me 30 seconds to get to the bit I want, versus, oh, I have to open up this massive course and try and work out where that information I wanted is. So reduce cognitive load, and I guess this kind of goes back to the last point. We know that if someone's on the move and they're doing mLearning and it's been identified that they're going to be on the move, they're going to be a little bit more distracted, and we want to, I guess, allow them to not have to remember so many things as we would expect them to do if they were doing a piece of e-learning at their desk. So reducing cognitive load is something obviously we strive for no matter what sort of solution we look like, but we have to be particularly mindful of it when we're talking about that mLearning space, because we know they've probably got a lot of stimuli and distractions already going on in the background. Um, so this is I guess circling back to the last point. Accept distractions. Don't I guess get frustrated when you're designing a solution that is mLearning and go, oh, I just need them to remember this bit and I need to reference back to that. Accept that they will be distracted. They are in an environment they don't have control of. They're not getting distracted deliberately. They're getting distracted because that's the environment they're in, and that happens to be that, their situation. So I think accepting that people will get distracted and being able to ask yourself as you're designing the solution, hey, if I'm at this point and all of a sudden I see something that completely breaks my chain of thought, if I return to that point that I was at and look at that screen, will I be able to continue on quite quickly, or will it completely throw out my learning experience and I'll have to go back 3, 4, 5 screens to understand how I arrived at that point before the distraction came about? And the other thing is, and this is, I guess, a very sweeping statement, and I guess this applies both for e-learning, but for mLearning in particular, because as I said, for me, mLearning is very closely aligned to on-demand learning. One of the things that makes on-demand learning challenging for a lot of organizations is all of a sudden reporting on it is a bit trickier. If people are accessing things when they want to, how do you report who's completed what and if everyone's on the same level? So I think the big piece when it comes to on-demand training and mLearning is focus on the outcomes. So if someone's doing this particular training, or if they've got access to these resources, look at how their behaviors change, look at the performance outside of the LMS, and I guess be able to measure that, okay, they've done a few bits of training. They haven't done as much training as Terry, but they've done a little bit more than Jane, but they've still achieved the same outcomes. Just because someone hasn't completed a particular piece of mLearning doesn't mean that necessarily they're not going to be able to achieve the same outcomes as someone else who has. We have to consider that everyone's got different backgrounds, different, I guess, experience that they bring into it. So they may not need to complete the same stuff. And we generally trust that our learners will be able to identify, hey, I already know about this topic, so I probably won't do it. I'll move on to the next topic, which will actually provide me the best amount of value. And what I find is if people are very fixated as an organization or a HR department or L&D department on tracking, yes, everyone's got to tick against these resources, it actually provides, I guess, a quick way to disengage people, because what you end up doing is you ask people who haven't done a piece of learning, why haven't you done it? You have to do it. There needs to be a tick next to this, rather than focusing on, hey, you're performing the way you need to. I understand why you haven't done it. So I think really focusing on outcomes and not reports is something that's applicable to, I guess, all learning to begin with. But mLearning and that on-demand learning in particular, if you try and, I guess, do reports of 100% completion, all that on demand learning, it's just going to become push learning again, and you've come full circle and you haven't achieved what you're after. So that's, I think, enough talking from me. From here, if anyone has any questions, please flick them through using the question system in the GoTo app. And whilst I'm waiting for questions to come through, I'll just quickly jump to the next screen to talk about, we've got another event that's coming up. This one is on the 22nd of October. It's talking about how e-learning fits into the learning ecosystem. For those of you who are aware of the learning ecosystem, it's going to be a bit of an introduction. We're co-hosting it with one of the practice directors from Future Knowledge. It'll be a really interesting piece. And for those who aren't aware of what the learning ecosystem is, it'll be a great opportunity to get a little bit of an insight into what it is, how it fits into organisations, and why it's a really cool approach to, I guess, delivering the best outcomes for your audience. So that's obviously coming up. Still waiting on questions, so I'll just quickly go to the next slide as well. And then obviously, if you want to connect to us, we're on Twitter. We've obviously got our website. And if you have any questions that you want to flick through to me directly, or ideas or all that, I love speaking with people in the L&D e-learning space, back and forth of ideas around, and occasionally, just an opportunity to vent around, oh, it's so terrible that this constantly happens in the industry. So feel free to contact me directly, as I really enjoy just having a chat with people and I guess providing some context, providing some insight, and, you know, helping maybe overcome some sort of challenge. So yeah, any questions? Very quiet this morning. You guys not had enough coffee? Alrighty, well, sounds like we've got a very very quiet audience this morning. Oh, hang on. I've got a question, but the question is you've covered everything. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you feel that way. Fantastic. So from here, our webinars are available for rewatching on our YouTube channel. So this one will be up there in the next few days. At the end of this, I do shoot through a bit of a feedback form rather, just to get your thoughts. So one of the things we want to make sure is we're creating webinars and material that you guys are interested and you guys will get something out of it. So feel free to complete that feedback form. It'll be really fantastic. It's an opportunity for you to give me feedback on how the presentation went. Also an opportunity for you to say, hey, it'd be really awesome if you guys could do something on the topic of X, Y, Z, whatever that looks like. You know, for example, do we want to do something on gamification? So that'll come through. And then as mentioned, just keep an eye on our events page. We constantly keep that updated with what we're doing. At the moment, we've got a few webinars that are in the pipeline that'll take us through to the end of the year. And then we're going to also explore some other avenues. So for those who are interested, we're probably going to look at having some Blab events, which is a cool little tool. For anyone who hasn't heard of Blab, I'm actually very new to it. I've only participated as a watcher in one, but it's an opportunity where you get people just talking and contributing and sort of an informal workshop social type event, really good fun. So yeah, absolutely keep an eye out on our events page. Other than that, thank you very much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure talking through all that. I hope you all took away something that'll be useful, and I hope it's also left you with a lot of questions to ask yourself and kind of go, wow, I never considered that. That's something to now explore. So I hope everyone has a fantastic Thursday, and again, thank you for your time.